From here, high on Saintbury, you can look out on 1,000 years of Froyle. Nearly 1,000 years ago, at his Christmas court in 1085, William the Conqueror launched the Doomsday Survey of all England. The entry for Froyle states, "Froyle, it was ever there." And indeed, man had lived on these downs centuries before Doomsday. In the autumn of 1982, this team from the North East Hampshire Archaeological Society made an exploratory excavation here near Yarnham's. Evidence of a round barrow and pottery dating from the Bronze Age to around 55 BC were found. The team's leader believed that there could well have been a Bronze Age settlement nearby. The Romans built villas in the area, the Anglo-Saxons tilled the land, and then, after Doomsday, came the Pilgrims. Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, recorded the pilgrimages from Winchester to Canterbury along the route that would become known as the Pilgrim's Way. The modern traveller approaches Froyle on the A31, which follows the line of the old Pilgrim's Way. In Chaucer's time there was not one single route, but a wide spread of trackways whose use depended on the weather and the season. In the summer, the pilgrims would take the easier tracks along the River Way, in the valley below the downs. Down here by the river, the pastures were lush and green, and it is not surprising to find Froyle's mill tucked away below the village. These ancient trackways still exist, criss-crossing the downs. Names like the Sheep Drove reveal their original use when large flocks of sheep were driven from the fairs at Way Hill to the Channel ports. When the winter rains came, the pilgrims and travellers would move further up out of the valley, and their way would lie through Froyle. Standing astride the winter route is the church of St Mary in Upper Froyle. There was a church here before Chaucer, as the Doomsday Survey records
15 villages and 23 small alders, with 8 ploughs, a church, 10 slaves, 2 mills at 22 shillings and sixpence, meadow, 8 acres.
The modern map still shows clearly the parallel routes, winter in yellow and summer in red, in fact the A31 today. The travellers would continue on their way to Lower Froyle and then to Bentley. The view from Lower Froyle has changed little over the years. The church has borne silent witness over the centuries and still carries the marks of the men who rebuilt the tower over 250 years ago. The east window is much older than that. The upper lights of its stained glass date back to the early 14th century, and may well have been a gift to the new church from Edward II. At Doomsday, William I gave the manor to the nuns of St Mary's at Winchester, and it was held by them until the dissolution in 1538. This manor is mainly the area known today as Upper Froyle. At the dissolution, the manor of Froyle came into the possession of William Jeffson, who in 1588 built Froyle Place on the site of the old medieval manor house adjacent to the church. This drawing, showing the south face of the building, was made around 1660. The tenement with the longest history in the village is Hussey's in Lower Froyle. The manor of Hussey's was acquired around 1260 by Walter Hussey, and later bought by the Jeffsons of Froyle Place. Brocas Farm takes its name from John de Brocas, a refugee from Gascony who took service with Edward III. He fought at Cressy and at the Siege of Calais, and for his services he became Sir John Brocas, receiving manors in about 7 places in Hampshire, including Froyle. Brocas was also acquired by the Jeffsons, and, like Hussey's, became part of the chief manor. Henry VIII was the monarch who shaped the face of Froyle for the next 400 years. The dissolution of the monasteries, begun in 1536, meant that many church properties were sold to the gentry to raise money for the king. The Jeffsons, for example, bought the manor of Froyle. For 200 years, events of history passed Froyle by. But, at the end of the 18th century, great things were happening in the two villages. And it was all because of this: the hop. The area was ideally suited for the growing of hops, and by the early 1700s the profits had become very good indeed. Obviously we have no pictures from that age, but Lillian Smither, a daughter of the Westbrook family who we shall meet later on, wrote in 1962 about her memories of working in the hop gardens in the early part of the 20th century.
Whole families went into the gardens, babies in prams, toddlers and school children of all ages. Many old folk wouldn't have missed the hop-picking season for anything. The hops were always picked during the school summer holidays, and it certainly gave the children something to do. We were expected to pick hops and not play around, but we had our fun. Dinner was often eaten in the gardens, with hands half black with the stain of the hops, and oh, what a bitter taste was mingled with the sandwiches, pies and apples.
Now, at the start of the 21st century, these are the only hop gardens in Froyle. The other crop which brought great riches to the landowners of the 1700s was wheat. Standing here overlooking Upper Froyle in the summer of 1995, it is difficult to visualise the great changes that have taken place in farming in as short a time as 70 years. Not all of the old country ways have been lost. This hedge layer was working in the new churchyard in Upper Froyle in the early summer of 1999. But let us return to the story of Froyle. After about a century of high arable and hop profits, the standard of living had risen to a degree where the timber-framed 16th century houses ceased to suffice a community in which the farmer was called gent on his grave. A phase of almost universal rebuilding followed. Sylvester's farm was the first, when a new wing was added to an earlier Tudor timber-framed house in 1674. This part of Hodges, facing the road, was added to a 16th century house in 1766, and is the most accomplished piece of brick building in the village. In 1770, Sir Thomas Miller purchased Froyle Place with the whole of the manorial rights. The Millers would remain in Froyle for another 170 years. This photograph, taken around 1866, shows members of the Miller family on the terrace of Froyle Place. By this time, Sir Charles Hayes Miller, Sir Thomas's grandson, was lord of the manor, but he would die 2 years later, at the age of 38. His son Hubert, on the left in the picture, became the 8th Baronet, and lord of the manor, at the tender age of 9. After the death of Charles Hayes Miller, the family moved away from Froyle, and until 1940, Froyle Place was let to various tenants. In 1656, the Birmingham family had purchased houses in Lower Froyle, and they soon ran into trouble with the manor of Froyle, refusing to pay dues as they considered Houses a manor in its own right, which it wasn't. By the early 1800s, this rivalry had developed to the stage where Thomas Birmingham built Froyle House in Upper Froyle, on the site of Catley's farm, which the family had owned since their arrival in Froyle 200 years earlier. This did not endear them to the Millers, as Catley's farm had been directly opposite Froyle Place, right in the middle of Miller territory. Froyle House, pictured here in 1915, has changed little in nearly 100 years. It is now the headquarters of the Treloar Trust. This postcard view of the west side of the house illustrates the one feature that has been lost, the veranda. You can also see how subsequent owners have tidied up the rear of the building. In November 1915, the Froyle House estate was sold at auction, and these photographs from the sale brochure give a little idea of the interior. This is the dining room, and this the drawing room. The house is described as an old Georgian residence which enjoys a particularly healthy position. When Sir Thomas Miller purchased Froyle Place from Mary Nicholas in about 1770, she kept the dower house, which had been built for her by her son William, and a part of Froyle Park for herself. The only picture we have of the dower house is this drawing, executed in 1836. Today there is no trace of the building, which stood between Fern Cottage, the white cottage in the background, and the pond. Mary Nicholas and her descendants, the Moody's, lived in the dower house until 1860, when, after the death of Rebecca Moody, Sir Thomas Miller, who was the son of the original Sir Thomas, bought the house and demolished it, thereby gaining control over the whole of Froyle Park. Pictured here in 1905 and adjoining the grounds of Froyle Place is a house known today as the Manor House that was probably the home farmhouse of the estate. over the front door is one of the 19 statues of saints brought back from Italy by Sir Hubert Miller around 1900 and placed in niches and under eaves all over Upper Froyle. This particular saint is St Christopher. Also in Upper Froyle is another farmhouse, Blundon's, that dates back long before the days of the Miller family. This picture was taken around 1900. The house was originally built about 1450 and enlarged in the 1600s, at which time it was known as Forders. The name Blundon's comes from one Adam Blunden, who took out a lease on the property in 1759 and who was to become one of the overseers of the poor in Froyle. It too gained a statue thanks to Sir Hubert Miller, in this case St Peter, holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven. After Adam Blunden, the house was occupied by members of the Simpson family, who also ran the butcher's shop in Upper Froyle, which we will visit later. In 1892, Sir Hubert Miller returned to Froyle to live at the Shrubbery, originally a river-keeper's cottage, and in the first years of the 20th century, a much quieter place than today. Nowadays, the A31 has become a busy dual carriageway, but Shrubbery House, as the Shrubbery is now known, has changed little in 100 years. It too has a saint, St Michael, slaying the dragon. In this photograph, taken about 1895, Sir Hubert is in the garden of the Shrubbery with his gardener, Gerald Robinson. This more formal photograph was taken on the 28th of September 1928, on the occasion of Sir Hubert's 70th birthday. While the Birminghams and Millers were shaping Upper Froyle, Lower Froyle was quietly developing as a wealthy farming community. Sylvester's, owned by the Birminghams, had been let to various families in the 1800s. When this photograph was taken at the turn of the last century, George Herriot Westbrook had been the tenant since 1894. George is most likely the man sitting in the trap on the right of the frame. The Westbrook family stayed at Sylvester's until 1934. This particular view was taken in 1915 for the sale brochure of the Froyle House estate. We saw other pictures from it at Froyle House. In 1918, this delightful picture was taken outside the front of Sylvester's on the occasion of the wedding of Edith Westbrook to Daniel Kemp. The whole area around the farm has changed little in 100 years. Only the traffic has increased. At the northern end of Lower Froyle has been quite a bit of change. When the Westbrooks left Sylvester's in 1934, they moved to a house that is no longer in existence. Rock House Farm. Pictured here in the 1940s, Rock House Farm was derelict by 1962 and demolished soon afterwards. The tithe map of 1847 shows a more built-up area than today. The houses to the south of the road were demolished around 1900 and replaced by these more modern cottages, Rock Cottage and Rose Cottages. They were built by another Westbrook, William, and his initials, the date of construction, are plainly visible today. This photograph shows Rose Cottages when they were very new, in the days when farm life was very different indeed. Just down the road is Hodges Farm, which we mentioned earlier. Looking from above the village today, you can see the well-preserved oast house at the back of the farm. There was a fire here in September 1895, when one William Bunce, a hop dryer, lost his life. The Hampshire Herald reported the evidence given to the coroner's jury by his son Arthur.
On Wednesday night, the 18th inst, 9:30, deceased and myself were moving hops. I was shoveling and father was sweeping behind me to dry hops off the kiln. There was a lamp hung close to the doorway. It was a paraffin lamp with a wire all round the glass. As I was throwing the hops out the doorway, the handle of the shovel struck the bottom of the lamp and knocked it over. As it was falling, the oil fell out and a blaze struck up all around my feet. I couldn't see me father, so I jumped down into the storeroom and from there down to the ground outside. The other fella, William Pinnell's, done the same. I couldn't get through the flame to me father. He was a fairly active man. It was impossible for me to get at my father. There was an aircloth there and blazed up immediately. I picked up the lamp directly it fell and slung it out of the door, and the oil dropped as I threw it.
The inquest was held at the nearby Travellers' Rest public house, now a private dwelling. Froyle, like many villages, was blessed with an abundance of public houses, malt houses and beer houses. In Lower Froyle, besides the Travellers' Rest, which was adjacent to Rockhouse Farm, there was, and still is, the Anchor. The Anchor is first mentioned in records in 1806, but it is much older than that, and is reputed to date back to the 14th century. Sadly, the oldest photograph we have of it is only 50 years old, but the modern Anchor has changed little in that time. The other public house in Lower Froyle was the Prince of Wales, although the name was not shown in records until 1891. Before this, it was described as a malt house. This photograph, taken around 1895, shows a group of ladies taking refreshment in what is now the garden of one of the bungalows. We believe that the lady with the walking stick is the wife of the landlord, Middleton Young. These were the days when the maltster would brew his own ale, although by the time of these pictures the Prince of Wales was owned by Crowley's Brewery in Alton. At the start of the 20th century, Crowley's decided to replace the Prince of Wales with a modern building. Plans were drawn up in October 1908 by the Farnham architect Arthur J. Stedman. The new building was one of 4 public houses built at the same time in the area. Besides the Prince of Wales, there was the Gardener's Arms at Hartley Wintney, the Jolly Miller at North Warnborough, and the Queen's Arms at Ushot. The new Prince of Wales had 4 bars, a saloon, a public, a jug and a tap bar. The regulars had their own seats so that when you walked in you could immediately see who was missing. For over 70 years the pub flourished, but by the end of the 20th century it was no longer viable, and in 1998 it was sold for conversion into a private house. The new owners decided to call their house the Old Malt House, recalling the original census records where the tenants lived at Malt House. During the rebuilding, the actual date of construction was discovered on these floorboards under the water tanks, where the builders had signed their names all those years ago. In Upper Froyle was the Hen and Chicken. Situated on what is now the busy A31, this is the earliest recorded inn in Froyle. It was built in 1740 as a chaise house, following the construction 10 years earlier of a new coach road. Here, stagecoaches would stop to pick up and drop off passengers. The inn provided food and lodgings, and, with stables at the rear of the building, travellers could hire horses to journey on to nearby villages. In this picture, taken around 1902, the name on the sign is given as the Hen and Chickens, a name that lasted well into the 20th century. This lovely old picture from the late 1800s shows the fireplace in the inn, with the partitions above the fire for holding mail. Today the name is spelt correctly, and modern road reconstruction has taken the main road away from the front door of the Hen and Chicken. As well as all these drinking establishments, Froyle was blessed with several brewers, the best known being William Messenger, who had a brewery in Hussey's Lane. Today there is still a brewery cottage and old brewery house. At the bottom of Hussey's Lane is the village pond, the sole permanent survivor of some 17 ponds which were recorded in 1847. Earlier in the 20th century, it was also used by the blacksmith, whose forge was adjacent to the brewery, for setting the iron tyres on cartwheels. The carts were driven into the pond to cool the iron and shrink it onto the wooden wheels. The only other pond, in Upper Froyle, tends to dry out. Another pond, again in Upper Froyle, was turned into an open space to commemorate the Silver Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth in 1977. Adjacent to Jubilee Green is Gothic Cottage. Again, little change since this photograph was taken in 1928, when it was the home of Harold and Hilda Horn. Hilda is shown at the front door. Harold was head gardener at Froyle Place for Colonel Innes until 1933, and his sons, Derek and Colin, kindly lent us his diaries, in which he kept notes of the day-to-day activities on the estate. They also let us borrow this notebook, in which he drew the planting plans for the various borders. This is the border, on the right in the modern picture, at the main entrance of Froyle Place. Froyle was a very labour-intensive community. We have seen some of the big houses and the farms, but where did the workers live? Beyond Gothic Cottage lies the barracks, which were almshouses in the 18th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, French prisoners were housed there, hence the name barracks. For a short time after the Second World War, the name of the cottages was changed briefly to the Square, but they are the barracks today. The census of 1881 shows this family living in just one of these cottages, which were then only one up, one down, with no modern sanitation, electric lighting or mains water. It is important to remember that many of the houses and cottages that we know of today as single buildings have been converted from 2 or 3 cottages in a row. Blunden's Farm Cottage, pictured here in the late 1920s, is a good example of this. Today it looks as though it's always been one cottage, but in the late 1800s it was 2, each one up, one down, with a small scullery and lean-to on the side. Downstairs there are 2 staircases, and upstairs the 2 buildings have been linked with a door between the beams, which is only a few feet high.
Makes you wish it were a tiny little bit shorter.
It too has a saint, the Sacred Heart, presented to Wilfred Andrew, who lived there at the time, by Sir Hubert Miller, somewhere around 1926. These cottages in Lower Froyle, photographed here in 1947, are known today as Ewe cottages. They have been called Brockus Corner cottages, as they were owned by Brockus Farm, and Hadwick's Corner, after Henry Hadwick, who lived there around 1880. The modern named Hussey's farmhouse could be one of the oldest houses in Lower Froyle, parts of it dating back to the 15th century. There is no doubt about the date of Limmet cottages. In common with many houses in Froyle, the builder inscribed his initials and the date in the brickwork. Just down Hussey's Lane is what is today called the Cottage, but was known as Ford's Cottage because, you've guessed it, a Jonathan Ford lived there around 1841. He was a servant at Hussey's, just over the road, and lived with his daughter Harriet, who was a dressmaker. This photograph of Ford's cottage was taken in the 1930s. Whilst we are talking about places named after people, let's visit Lawrence's Lane, or Croucher's Lane, also known as School Lane, and today as Park Lane. In 1873, the Mills family came to live at Lilac Cottage, number 4 Park Lane. Jane, George, and their children Emily, Jane, Annie and Charlie are pictured here outside the cottage in about 1901. Emily, leaning against the porch, would become a leading light in the Froyle Methodist Church. She and Louise Hall, seated in this picture, were joint Sunday school superintendents for many years, as well as playing the organ in church. There had been Methodist meetings in the old workhouse, known today as Brecklands, as early as 1846, but it wasn't until 1861 that a church was built in Lower Froyle. It actually opened in 1862. The church thrived until the end of the 20th century, when falling numbers and mounting costs caused its closure in 1998. There was a final service on Sunday, May the 17th of that year.
Lovely to see you.
Can I get in? There's a room.
I'm not as
Behind the rafters.
absolutely certain. I don't know if you can.
The Methodist Church was not the first church to close in Lower Froyle. Until 1967, when it was demolished, St Joseph's Church stood opposite the Prince of Wales. Sir Hubert Miller, concerned that his parishioners in Lower Froyle had to travel to St Mary's to worship, had St Joseph's built in the late 1800s. His intention was to build a proper church opposite the recreation ground, but the land was requisitioned for council houses after the Great War, and Lower Froyle never did get its church. One fact that is not obvious from these pictures is that St Joseph's was clad almost entirely in red corrugated iron, very hot in summer and noisy when it rained. So far we have not looked at the shops in Froyle, of which there were many, mostly just front rooms in cottages. Down by the corner of Huss's Lane, circled in the picture, was a confectioner's and tobacconist's run by Mrs. Holland. At Leacott, just above Park Lane, there was a grocer's shop in the 19th century run by an Edwin Warren. In Upper Froyle in the 1800s, Chestnuts was not there. Behind it was a building known as Jointure House. A jointure house is similar to a dower house, a house built for a widow for the period she survives her husband. The Simpson family were butchers by trade and lived at Jointure House and then the Chestnuts until 1926. There are still signs of the butcher's shop in the garage, with hooks in the ceiling for hanging meat and a serving hatch to the rest of the house. The outbuildings were used as a slaughterhouse. Next door was the post office, photographed here in 1908. Stamps, etc. were sold from a small window by the front door. In the late 1800s it was also a carpenter's shop with a saw pit at the front. The saint here is St Hubert, with the stag that led to his conversion. At the back of the post office in the garden is what looks like a piece of slate. Closer examination reveals it to be part of a clock face, with the hole for the shaft that held the hands clearly visible. A plan of nearby St Mary's from the late 1700s shows the clock face in its original position, on the church tower. Another echo from the 18th century is to be found in Lower Froyle, at the rear of Warren Cottage, the building on the far left of this picture. In this barn, again in the late 1700s, Aquila Clapshoe made cricket bats. His son, pictured here, went on to found Aquila Clapshaw and Salmon, who continued bat making in London until the 1970s. We cannot leave the shops of Froyle without visiting Brown John Stores, pictured here after its refurbishment in 1908. The shop traded as a grocer's from 1841 until 1989, and today it is an art gallery. This lovely picture shows Alfred and Kate Brownjohn with their sons, Charles, Thomas and Harold, just before the First World War. Before its modernisation in 1908, Brownjohn Stores looked more like a trading post in the Wild West. This view from the field by Sylvester's shows the gates across the entrance to the shop. Before the village school was built, children were taught at day schools in various houses in the village. In 1852, Henry Birmingham built a schoolroom onto the front of Froyle Cottage. The school was run by his coachman's daughter, Letitia Enifer. Froyle National School, as it was known then, was founded by Sir Charles Hayes Miller in 1867, but not opened until after his death in 1868. 70 out of the 138 pupils admitted had come from the day school at Froyle Cottage. Froyle School lasted for 118 years, during which time there was little change to the size of the building. The school roll at the end in 1986 was just 20 children. The best remembered headmaster was Tom Knight, who was also an amateur historian, and much of his research has been consulted for this documentary. The last head teacher was Nora Jupe, pictured here receiving a token of appreciation from Roger Haddock, the Assistant Area Education Officer, at the closure of the school. There are many photographs of school groups. This is possibly the earliest, taken around 1880, and it is fitting that we finish with a small selection of them. Looking at these images of the last 2 centuries, you might think that this was a golden age, now long past, when life was simple and uncomplicated. But browse through the church registers and you will find, amongst the happiness of baptisms and marriages, tales of sadness and tragedy.
(1841) December the 23rd. Buried Caroline Lunn, aged 2 years. 1842, January the 22nd. Buried Bridget Lunn, aged 6 years, and Samuel Lunn, aged 4 years. January the 27th. Buried Shadrach Lunn, aged 1 year. February the 9th. Buried Jane Lunn, aged 1 year. 1852, August the 10th. Buried Harriet Lunn, aged 9 years. August the 17th, buried George Lunn, aged 6 years. August the 26th, buried John Lunn, aged 5 years. 1865, buried Alice Hathaway, aged 3 days. 1879, February the 8th, buried John.
But what of tomorrow? At the start of a new millennium, Froyle looks to the future and reflects on its past.
I have very great pleasure in unveiling the Froyle Parish map for the Millennium, AD 2000. B, will you please? The church project The stained glass window is nearly with us.
I pronounce this playground open.
One of our students, Hayden Spencer, is going to unveil.
The book will be on sale at the Froyle exhibition in July 2000. There'll be parties too, parties for every age group.
Just gonna get it down, we've got 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.